Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to EduGrowth's EdTech Showcase on empowering learners in the world of AI. My name is Luke Seacombe. I am the Head of Engagement at EduGrowth, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's program. If you're new to EduGrowth, and if you are, thank you for joining. We are Australia's education, technology, and innovation industry hub. Through connection and collaboration, we accelerate Australia's EdTech ecosystem globally. Before we begin today's program, I would like us to pause to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise the continuous and unbroken connection to the land, waters, and culture across the country. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the country I am currently on, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. Now, this program is only possible through EduGrowth's partnership with ASCILITE. ASCILITE is a globally recognised and professionally connected community of professionals and academics working in fields associated with enhancing learning and teaching through a pedagogical use of technologies. ASCILITE seeks to shape the future of tertiary education in relation to technology-enhanced learning by enabling and sharing high-quality research, innovation, evidence-based technology, and enhanced practices. ASCILITE's annual conference is coming up on the 4th to the 7th of December this year at the University of Sydney. This conference will focus on reconnecting and the importance of relationship in higher education, which has never been more pronounced and especially important following the hard last few years we've faced. So hopefully you'll see the link provided to you now. So if you are interested, please feel free to register for that. Once again, thank you to ASCILITE, the ASCILITE team, for their support and their ongoing contributions to the Australian higher education ecosystem. In 2002, EduGrowth changed the way we do showcases by introducing our case study model. In this model, companies will discuss their solution and detail how they will connect with partners to innovate and increase the learner experience. This is a fantastic opportunity for educators to hear how Australian EdTech companies are creating real impact with learners. If you're watching and you have any questions for our presenters throughout today's program, please feel free to write them in the chat box to the right of your screen. With that in mind, I am delighted to welcome Dominic Separato. Dominic is the co-founder of Intern Match, helping solve the global employability problem by placing interns into internships on behalf of educational providers. He is a serial entrepreneur who's always happy to give guidance to new founders. He is going to be looking after the first component of today. Very excited to have him here. So Dominic, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thanks, Luke, and very happy to be here and welcome everybody. AI is going to play a massive part in our business. We also have my colleague Sub, who joins us. He is the AI guru in the business, and without his expertise, there he is, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So together we're going to tell you all about how we use AI in the products that we have in our business, which is Intern Match, Mentor Match, and Cred Match. So we did prepare some beautiful slides. Hopefully you'll be able to see them shortly, and we will kick off from there. Alrighty. So Intern Match, what do we do? Well, we solve the global employability problem through internships. We also do a lot of mentorships as well. And we do this at scale, which is where AI comes into it. And we have a massive problem, and that is that with the universities that we work with, we often get cohorts up to 1,000 interns at a time. All of those need to be interviewed. They need to be able to browse internships, find companies, company supervisors. We need to give them mentors, and we sometimes need to group them together with other interns in group internships. A massive, massive job if you have to do it with human intelligence, which is just us humans. And so the reason for us to use AI is really for speed, to get all this stuff done a lot quicker. But more importantly than that is fairness. And that is, if we have 1,000 students at a time that we need to match to 1,000 companies and internships, how do we make it fair for everyone? because the natural thing is to take your best student and place them at the best company, but that always doesn't give us the best outcomes. So we need to optimize this matching across interns, companies, company supervisors, mentors, internships, and also industries that people wish to work in, removing the bias that humans have and the prejudices they may have also. And so the number one consideration for us is fairness. How do we make sure that everyone gets a perfect match? Not that there's ever a perfect match, but everyone is considered. And no one will ever get that perfect match. And we not only need to match the best students and the best companies, but we also need to pay attention to the worst students, although it's probably not a great way to call them, but for students that are not as advanced, and also companies that perhaps don't do what they're meant to do properly. So we need to put this into consideration as well. How do we do that? Sub, over to you.
Thank you, Dom. So yeah, Dom mentioned, the way that we actually tackle the issue of fairness and to remove human bias from our decision making process is through actually removing the human from the actual decision making process, and instead of that having sort of an automated system which will do everything by itself, so to speak, right? So that is where AI comes in. And the way that we actually implement AI at Intern Match is through the use of AI in the form of a platform as a service. And so, what does that exactly mean? Is that we have created a platform where we have listed the AI services that we have created, and depending upon the type of user that you are in our system, so you can be an agent, an intern, or a host company, you will have access to different AI services that you can use, and that will be made available to you. So at the heart of the AI services that we have are the machine learning algorithms that drive them, right? So these algorithms have been coded up in Python through the use of different libraries like scikit-learn, TensorFlow, PyTorch, etc. And they've been made available to end users by having them deployed on the AWS stack, as we've shown here. And so what AWS does is it allows us to very quickly prototype models and have them test in a production environment, which is possible through the use of ML workflows in SageMaker and EC2. And Lambda is a very essential one, which houses these models and makes them ready to be used upon the arrival of a quick trigger, which comes from an external source. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a bit. But just to touch upon the few services that we already have running, we have the speech to text sort of model that we have that converts spoken language into written text, and the users for that can be varied. We plan to use most of them we plan to use especially this one in a live interviewing sort of a tool where during an interview, the interviewer as well as the interviewee gets live updates. We also have the NLP, which is natural language processing, that allows us to do a lot of sentiment analysis, which is a very important tool when it comes to actually providing insights from language. We also have live transcriptions. We have live translation of languages. And one of the most important things is the recommendation engines, which is at the heart of the matching that we do, which can be the matching between an intern and a host company, or the matching between a mentor and a mentee, based on their profiles. And so the way that we actually train these models is through this method called as transfer learning, which essentially removes a lot of overhead that comes into play when you are training these huge models. What transfer learning allows us to do is it allows us to use pre-trained models which have been trained by these huge companies like Google and OpenAI and Hugging Face, who have trained their models on huge amounts of data, on terabytes of data sometimes, and they've made it available to use for the public in an open source way. We take these models, and since they've been already trained, we can just fine tune them on our data and have it ready to generate insights or to make any sort of analytical sort of predictions. And so that enables us to work in a very fast manner. And as you can see, the fact that we are using all of these services to generate almost real-time insights is very essential to us. We do that initially by having this transfer learning process, and also by the fact that we have our whole system set up in a way that it is constantly monitoring our environment, and we have the workflows and rules set up in the backend, which looks for triggers. For example, if you take the example of an agent who wants to place an intern in a host company, What the agent just needs to do is go on the platform, make the profile of a student, and that will then trigger the model that is running in the backend at AWS to start making recommendations and give the output to the agent. So you can see how this entire system is made to be fast, is made to be dynamic and real time. And also the data that we essentially get to train these models, to fine tune these models, comes from this very dynamic question and answer format, where we try to provide very smart questions to the users. And what that means is that essentially based on their answers, we're not going to just provide them static questions. It's going to change based on the answers that they give, which will then allow us to collect really good relevant data for our machine learning models. And what the solutions from these services are. Dom, you can take that as well.
Terrific. And Sub, a point that you picked up on that's really important is that the AI is useless unless we have this real-time Q&A engine in the background to deliver all of the services. So the outcomes for us in the Intern Match AI engine is that we can actually get everyone matched at the same time. And matching is fairer. It includes the worst students as well as the best students, and the worst companies with the best companies. There's no human bias and prejudice, and our matching is more consistent, and it frees up our agents to handle the edge cases. But there's other things that we are using our AI engine for. And here's a couple of examples I'm about to show you. Whenever we get a cohort like we've got currently, we have about 1,000 South African interns that we need to place into companies here in Australia. They require about 3,000 interviews in order to get them placed. And that will involve, and I'd made a mistake there, that should read 9,000 people, not 900 people, all with different calendar preferences. So the interns, the agents, the company supervisors, HR managers, all of those people, we need to coordinate all of them into these 3,000 interviews. And you can just imagine if we have to do this manually, this would just take a power of effort and a power of manpower. So that's where AI is helping us with the scheduling of interviews. We also are using AI in order to prepare our interns and our host company reps for the interview. So if we look at someone's profile, and depending on the internship that they're going into and the company that they're going into and the person who's going to interview them, we can perhaps come up with the best questions to ask that student. And this will save everybody time. In fact, we've got it down now that we pre-send these interview questions to the students so they can create a short video, which will be used for multiple interviews that they may need to attend, again, speeding up the placement service. The other one, which I know, Sub, this is a favourite of yours, you might want to talk about the live interviewing.
Sure. So what we're planning to do with the live interviewing tool is, as I mentioned before, it's going to be a live speech-to-text conversion system, which the interviewer as well as the interviewer will have access to. And upon their screen, they will be provided with live feedback as to if, for example, a person is speaking too fast or too slow, what sort of vocabulary is being used, what sort of sentiment of the entire interview is going. If there is a disparity between sort of the interviewing aspect of it, if it's different between the interviewer and the interviewee, there will be a live feedback. I mean, you don't have to wait for the interview to get over to sort of see if your interview is going properly or not. And it also helps the interviewer to come up with better questions for the interviewee as well, to make them feel more comfortable, maybe, of that sort of a thing.
Terrific, and that's all done in real time, which I think is going to be a bit of a game changer in the industry. A big part of interning too is the logbooks, and we already do quite a bit of this, and that is that we run sentiment analysis on the entries that the interns make at the end of each day. And in this way, we can work out if there are any issues, and we can jump on them straight away, and the system will send out automated alerts and alarms, and also provide that reporting to the universities, who are very, very keen on transparency of what these students are doing in their internships. And the last one, I think, behavioural monitoring. So this is an opt-in intern match and mentor match app, where so that we know if the intern's actually even turning up. And then we can have automated notifications, especially for our international students who perhaps don't have a sense of how long it takes to get places, especially early on in the internship. We can send them reminders to say, hey, you need to leave in the next half hour in order for you to make it. And perhaps if they're going into areas that are particularly OH&S sensitive, have you got your PPE with you to ensure that you stay safe? Finally, health checks. And that is checking in with all of the people in our ecosystem to make sure that they're all feeling okay. And then we can act on that. So really what we're trying to do is that we're trying to get AI to look after all the volume and free up our people to go and look at all the edge cases.
Dom, I'm gonna jump in there. Dom and Sab, thank you so much. Some really interesting thing. I've got some notes. I've got some questions that I need to ask. So, Dom, the work placement and internships are now becoming so important for learners. They really need to develop the soft skills. They really need to increase their employability. How does AI help you navigate this on behalf of those learners?
Well, the universities now are embedding this into their curriculums more and more, but they've got a big issue in that how do you get the host companies and how do you place all these kids at scale? Some universities may have 14,000 students in a particular faculty that they need to place. It's impossible to do that just with humans. Hence why we developed Intern Match, and that way we can solve that problem for them by outsourcing it to us.
Brilliant. Now I need to go through this. The interview component that you mentioned is really fascinating. Sab, you mentioned that there's going to be real life feedback. We've only got a few minutes left, but I'd really like to know what does that look like? Because I know myself, when I've left an interview, you kind of leave and you don't know how you went and what it looked like. So what does that real live feedback look like?
So what we're planning to do is have different views for the interviewer and the interviewee, where on your screen, sort of like a HUD sort of a display will be available to you with live sentiments as to if it's going good or bad. Maybe a bar which shows you what sort of language is being used, if that language actually means that your interview is going good or bad. Also, like a live translation tool if that's required. Another important thing is whether the speech patterns that you're following during the interview, if that is going maybe too fast or too slow, and you need to maybe slow down a bit in order to get your points across better. The sort of vocabulary that you're using, everything is being included in that NLP and speech to text pipeline, which will be running continuously as the interview is going on, and it's going to give you live feedback in different views, if depending upon if you're an interviewer and an interviewee.
And I like the idea of just a score at the end. I mean, to leave an interview and know that you scored 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, I think that would be really cool.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree. I've got time for one quick question. Dom, you're going to have 30 seconds to answer this.
Sure.
The interview component, the health check component, they're really exciting things. But from your perspective, what's the real workhorse? What component do you feel is really changing the game that might not grab people's attention?
The two things for us is the matching of all the students to the internships. That's the big one for us, because that's what we get paid to do. But the other one is that the interviews is such a time-consuming thing in our business. If we can use AI to help us solve that, then that would just be magnificent from our point of view.
Perfect. We've ran out of time. We just did get a question in. Dom, I'll pass that on to you, and hopefully we can address that offline and get that answer to the person who asked the question. But Dom, Sab, thank you so much for sharing the details in such an incredible program. Some really exciting things happening at Intern Match. So thank you once again.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
We're now going to turn to the in-conversation component of today's programming on empowering learners in the world of AI. Today's session will be facilitated by Lisa Jacker, the Senior Lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Southern Queensland. Lisa is Senior Lecturer at the University of Southern Queensland in the School of Education. She's got over 18 years experience in higher ed at a number of different universities. Lisa's been an innovator in online education for most of her career, with a focus on engaging learners through integration of emerging technologies. Lisa, I'd like to welcome you to the stage, and I'll hand over to you to introduce Sarah and George.
Thanks, Luke. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. I'm also a member of the executive at ASCILITE, so I'm here with a couple of different hats on. So yes, we have people who really don't need much introduction, and I'm really looking forward to our exciting conversation that we're going to have over the next half an hour or so. So I can't see them on screen yet, so I'm assuming that they're coming in. We have George Siemens. Great. Fabulous to see you there, George. I was getting a bit worried that I wasn't going to get anybody in here with me. All right, I'll give George a brief introduction, but I'm sure most of you know about George, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what he's got to say in terms of AI. But George researches networks, analytics, and human and artificial cognition in education. He's the professor and director, and lucky us in Australia, of the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning at UniSA. He has delivered keynote addresses in more than 35 countries on the influence of technology and media on education, organisations and society. So welcome, George. And we have, I'm sure people are clapping in their rooms. And we have Sarah Howard, who's also joining us. There's Sarah, excellent. Sarah uses new technologies and data science to explore digital technology use in teaching and learning. Sarah has been at the University of Wollongong for over 12 years. Again, lucky us having her in Australia with us. And she's currently an associate professor of digital technologies in education, helping lead major projects of tech integration for classrooms. So welcome, both of you. Big round of applause. And our topic today is, and I'm sure we could all be talking about lots of different things, but we're focusing on empowering learners in a world of AI. And recently, and I've just read some wonderful papers that you've been writing collectively around this. And I'd like to throw it open to whichever one of you would like to start. And we were hoping to start with sort of what are the capabilities that are required, that people need now in the world of AI. So who'd like to start?
George, would you like to start?
Fabulous.
Well, on that case, I was happy to defer to you on this, Sarah, but I'll do a quick dive in on some of the capabilities of AI. First of all, AI is very much a present technology. We sometimes talk about it like a future or an anticipatory technology, that it's something that we need to start preparing for, but the reality of it is that we need to start reacting to AI. Now, one of the things that I think is particularly challenging in that regard is that many of the capabilities that we're experiencing with AI are behind the scenes. We're not aware of it. They're sorting things, they're organizing people, they're determining the kind of information that we see. So the effects of AI, one of the first challenges is to actually bring it to the forefront. And by bringing it to the forefront, I mean to understand that it's already there, it's already doing things. And I think perhaps as consequentially, it's already changing us and is changing the way that we engage in things. I'm not quite sure where I drop links in, but if any of you are randomly bored, there's the Electronic Freedom Foundation has a site called the AI Progress Index. And if you just look at some of the resources that they have available, they clearly detail domains that used to be ours, right? Game playing that used to be ours, or acts of creativity that again used to be ours. Those are now rapidly being taken over by AI. And the growth is exponential, which means that what's a general concept now is a lived reality in the AI field really quickly. So some of the domains that's had enormous progress in areas of creativity, DALL-E 2 comes to mind, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and others that sort of fit into that profile. Almost daily, the big tech companies are announcing a massive new language model, a speech-to-text model that increased efficiency. The group that just spoke prior to us talked about the use of AWS infrastructure for building your AI platforms, tool sets, and so on. So you can run, build, and deploy AI functionality at a really sophisticated level today with really insignificant dollars. So to get to your question, I think more directly, there's a range of lived experiences we're having with AI that right now are primarily addressing behind the scenes organizing and coordinating information that we're starting to respond to. But I think very quickly the practicality of it will start to be felt in campuses really, and classrooms really, really quickly.
Yeah, I would follow on to that in the idea that the level of awareness is probably one of the biggest capabilities that we need to build up. And in fact, just last night, I was teaching one of my master's subjects, and we were talking about AI. And I said to them, it's all around you. I said, it's all around me, literally right now. And I said, where is it? And they didn't know that the blurring effect, they didn't understand how that worked, and that was algorithmic, and that and to understand my shape and how it dealt with the background. And so it's quite interesting, and they have some awareness of what sits around us, but not much, or an interesting kind of common sense understanding of it. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot is the idea that to help students, to empower students to be able to build these capacities to be able to critically engage as they move through their own learning, as they move into future world, that teachers need to have a quite much more advanced development of their understanding of data, of how even simple AI works. Not that they need to be building it, but the logics behind it, or some of the ways that these tools impact on us, and the ways that we interact with them, and how we make choices around that. And for us, that's one of the biggest things, is how we make choices around the tools that we use, the data that we share, and that involves probably a lot more understanding of what is truly around us, but also a better understanding of where we are with AI, and then how that moves. So where it is really, so the kind of intelligence that we're dealing with, but what is also rapidly coming. So that level of awareness to be able to situate themselves in that kind of socio-technical world is really something we need in education, but we also really need it in the everyday as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And that made me think about, like, and nice that you said the everyday, because I'm thinking we need conversations, don't we? Like within, like our whole society needs different sorts of conversations to maybe the ones we're having at the moment about AI, which is just touching the surface. Mm-hmm. And, you talk about teachers and in education, and are we talking about what's happening then in schools? So with our youth and our younger people, are we talking about what's happening in universities? How are we crossing those? How are we hitting those touch points? What should we be doing to get here?
I think the way what we talk about, and we talk about kind of building those conversations, that's a really nice way to think about it, and building some transparency around the tools that we are interacting with more and more in increasingly complex ways, and that have increasing levels of impact on the things that we do and the way that we understand the world. I think when we talk about it at the schools level, it is building kind of our students' understanding, but also the ways of negotiating themselves with their own data and with their own feedback that they receive, and with their own way of wanting to interact. And very much that they want to interact with technology. And I think that's something people need to be able to empower themselves and to have agency in that space. I think when we move up to higher education, it becomes a little bit more complicated in terms of how we're asking students to engage, and what we can expect or can't expect as fundamental knowledge. I think in the higher education space, it becomes, and I could be wrong, this is probably debatable, and we could maybe talk about this, the tools, the digital tools that sit in our disciplines. What are the ways that we work? And I think that's where that changes a bit more when we look more specifically at, like, how are we working? What are the tools we have available to us in our different spaces? I'm in a school of education. And so for me, we're starting to look at so that's why my example goes to teachers specifically. What are teachers dealing with? A big question right now are the tools around teachers' work, how those can work. Do teachers have the literacies to be able to engage with those in fruitful ways to get the benefits that we want from it? And also, how do we understand the data or the tools that we have to understand learning paths and progressions and things like that? Are we able to use them? Can we help our students be better prepared to use those tools when they go out into the world? But every discipline has those ways of working that we need to think about, and students need to be exposed to quite significantly, but also ways of thinking about how that progression is going to change and the ways of working are going to change. And I think that needs to be built into what we're teaching them now.
I mean, I think what is really interesting, and obviously I'm in a school of education as well, which is why I picked up on the teachers aspect, because then we also are thinking about that influence into, as I said, like to younger people. So in, where we take that as teachers into that other space as different from maybe if we're just in other disciplines in higher ed. So I'm interested, George, to hear your thoughts around any of that as well.
Well, I think one of the challenges that we're facing is with for many people, especially around the question of AI as an active tool in a classroom. It's somewhat hidden, as I noted earlier, and part of it is just surfacing it so we understand that it's already doing things in that regard. But there's a couple dimensions to look at with it. So on the one hand, and this is the lens of time, is probably the primary one to determine. Like if I was starting an EdTech company right now, I would 100% be AI up to my eyeballs. That is the innovation. And to put another way, the meta innovation, the alpha innovation of our generation is AI. We are seeing it writ large in one field after the other. Meaning that we're seeing the medical field, the military field, we're seeing banking. It's every field is being recentered around AI. So I think as a broad level, it's that recognition that these entire domains are going to be conceptualized with AI at the core. And if that's the case, which I mean, every other field is moving in that direction, including medical and healthcare and other areas, then the question starts to become, how do we view preparation in this domain? What does it mean to become AI ready and to be ready to integrate and use AI effectively? Now, a lot of us seem to think that we look at it at a classroom level, which is probably a great starting point. What does a teacher do differently when AI is a tool set that's available to her? What does a doctor do when she has access to AI in different kinds of setting and so on? So there's this sense in which our actions in learning and sense making and knowledge work are going to be altered through AI. It could just be information provision, recommendations, an indication that you should maybe make sure you address this. It could be a student is at risk of dropping out or discontinuing, and there could be an alert system, which in many cases, a valid argument would be, how is that AI compared to any other kind of data analysis that just simply is a risk or a predictive model? But nonetheless, those are simple ways at a classroom level where we can start to see those effects. And I think that's an area we should think about, we should look at, and that's where vendors are selling and startups are initiating their services. I think the area that I'm most interested, though, is the systemic effects of AI writ large. Which parts of the education system are redundant in a fairly profound way, and how could you do that differently? So I'll just give you 3 really quick examples just as an illustration. Right now, and I've whined about this for a while, but I've said, the biggest unsolved problem in the education sector are learner profiles. It's the thing that everything else hinges on, right? You do a good job with profiles, it changes how you teach, how you assess, how you graduate students. But so why aren't we working on building automated profiles of our students, even in clunky, rudimentary ways, but starting to move in that direction at a significant kind of dynamic? A second component is the idea of curriculum. Now, this is tied to learner profiles, but my view is that we should have computed curriculum, namely curriculum that is created and computed in real time for each individual learner. Now, at some point in some of the big US tech companies in the age of hype that have sort of faded away, that was a big thing. Personalized learning, adaptive learning was the word of the day. Companies like Newton and others were the ones that we were looking at that time. But there's no reason why we wouldn't have, at least at a conceptual level right now, to begin building our proficiencies in this computed curriculum. The other area is job skills and labor market match. Right now, much of what we do in our classrooms, certainly in universities, is we teach what we know. We don't always teach what students need to know. So we have our curriculum to work through. We have our textbooks to work through. We have our programs that we need to move students through. And so I think just those 3 quick illustrations, if you were to sit there and think, what happens if we could create an automated profile of our learners as they move through various parts of their formal and informal learning, and then we were able to compute curriculum in near real time to address the skills that they need or the qualification they need to hit in order to get a certain degree. And then at the same time to ensure that that curriculum is updated and refreshed based on job profiles in industry and what some of those needs are. So I think from my end, just to get to the point here, Lisa, my interest, I think, is in that latter domain. How does the systems change? The system itself change and readjust when AI starts to become a central driver for the effects and the outcome of that.
So the question is, how do we get there? What are the barriers to that at the moment?
Well, a couple. One is
I'm completely holding my tongue here.
I would say there's a number of barriers. The biggest one that I always feel, especially in universities, is we have long lived in a very privileged position where we could be a little chaotic, do our own thing, and people had to come to us. But there's a number of pressures coming from organizations, Coursera being one, but companies like Google and Microsoft are skilling their upcoming employees and staff through their own programs where they're running them outside of the university. A number of years ago, CAGO released a survey that said 59% of people working in data science acquired their skills through MOOCs or through self-directed learning, not through universities. And I think that says something. So I think first and foremost, what's preventing AI adoption is vision. I think a lot of the people that are leading our certainly higher education institutions have different problems that they're focusing on. They're not necessarily targeting what I'll call the alpha trend. They're not paying attention to sort of the meta trend, which is the trend which all trends are going to need to circle under. And so that's a big thing. Secondly, there's an investment problem in the academy or in universities, which is my particular lens. And it's hard to suddenly say, well, you know, we're running tight on budget. We have diminishing, obviously post-COVID with the international student crisis in Australia. We have less dollars, and it's hard to say we're going to pull a big chunk of money now to deploy and do this. But even if I had one university that said, hey, you know what, I am going to work on creating learner profiles for every student that graduates, and I'm going to run a skunkworks project that's going to create adaptive computed curriculum and so on. I mean, these are simple things that we're not playing in. We're acquiescing this territory to, drum roll please, big tech. So we're seeing companies like Google work around universities and Microsoft work around universities. And I think that's the issue. So first and foremost, vision is stopping it. Secondly, AI talent is stopping it as well. We don't have AI literacies at the level that we perhaps should be having in the academy. So that's another detail that stops it. I already mentioned the resource constraints. That's another thing that's stopping it. But I'd love to hear Sarah's list.
I think it's interesting. I was at a education showcase last week, and it was very interesting. The various, so these kinds of tools to shape curriculum, and I'll say shape curriculum, are we see a number of them, maybe not completely automated, so in terms of how they get kind of compiled by humans, then you kind of chop and change them and things like that. But it's interesting to, as a teacher, I saw that and I was like, oh, that's to relinquish. And I think this is the tension with things like that, to relinquish the control that we have over that knowledge to the machine. I can't say that we're doing particularly innovative things with curriculum, so I don't know that we're really kind of using our real strengths there. But but I think that's one of the limitations I would also put on that. It's just this tension, and we have this with a number of tools in terms of, and I think this is a limitation we have in taking advantage of some of the tools, or even getting in the development of it, is that we aren't quite, as a society, and this is something that might come from greater awareness, ready to let go of these, of this control that we have, of this knowledge. We're not quite ready to relinquish it, and myself included, because my reaction at first was, oh, you can't do that. You can't. How would you? Teachers must have control over their curriculum. But is it really in the benefit of it? And there are lots of things in there that can be automated, that can reduce the workload. They can be changed. They can be suggestions. They've been designed in ways that require the human intervention to polish it up, which is the combination that seems to work quite well, the two together. So it's interesting to think that even aside from, the resources or our capacity, I think also socially, we're not quite there. I think the level of concern and the level of fear for that loss of our own function in handing it over is one of our biggest barriers that we have. That, and I completely agree with George, a lack of vision also in that space. But I think the two go hand in hand. So there's a lot of work to be done to actually bring any of these things to fruition. They might be developed, but implementation on a large scale. And also change we won't see significant change until we're able to do that on a large scale. And there are a number of dimensions that go into that. And how do we get there? We're not even there with regular digital technologies that we've had in the educational space, we say regular ones, for decades. So, I think it'll be interesting to see if the technology push with the rate that it's going at right now, particularly after the pandemic, does push us towards that. And we see more adoption around in the schools level, less so at higher ed, around the idea of reducing work. And I see that as that is a quite fertile place. There seems to be a lot of interest in, again, just in the last couple of weeks of being around it and seeing the partnerships between those kinds of ed tech companies and in various educational departments. It's an interesting space to see what will happen there. So I think that's one of our big areas.
I mean, do you think that there is also this general nervousness around, AI due to, if I go back to kind of in a general public kind of way, the sorts of stories we tend to hear, it's very negative. It's about having your data mined and things like this happening and things automatically happening and we're going to lose our jobs. And, again, going back to that, how do we start to present other ideas about AI, like maybe, where is it creatively? How can we, if we use our imaginations, what could we actually be seeing that it is doing or that we could be doing?
I personally, I think there's a lack of discussion around the human-computer interaction. I think we don't bring that out enough in the fact that it is the combination. Right now, it's very much, I mean, George might think differently about this. I think it's very much, I think the power's in the two together. And in that, particularly in the education space, I don't think we do enough of that. I think, like you said earlier, Lisa, we don't do enough talking in general about what's really happening around AI. But I think that's one that we could really do a lot of great work with, and we're just not having that conversation for a lack of knowledge or a lack of interest or just being busy doing other things. We're not having those conversations, us with our machines,
Did you want to add to that, George? Although we've got a few questions from the audience, actually. We'd like to, okay, I think the challenge is the multiple data sources from various suppliers and stakeholders. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've spent over the last while. Sarah and I were involved in a Center of Excellence bid on AI and learning that we did a couple of years ago. I guess submitted a year ago plus. It wasn't shortlisted, but we spent a lot of time specifically looking at the data requirements and the necessary stakeholders that have to be willing to give you access to data and some of the ethics and related concerns. It's worth noting, though, that for model building in particular, in AI right now, it's between 70 and 80% of those models are built up from synthetic data. They're not built on real human data, which kind of strips away a lot of those ethical considerations around data and data use. But that's secondary from the question. I think primarily putting together multiple data sets has always been a challenge. It was early on when we started with learning analytics as a research domain and a field of practice. We spent a lot of time looking at exactly that kind of a question. How do you take your student information system, match it to, let's say, details within your LMS? How do you take that with a discussion forum platform that you use on a different company altogether? Now you add Microsoft Teams to it. You've got Zoom. You've got just a range of data that's being captured in different spaces, and it doesn't always fit together. It doesn't always play well. So absolutely, data management is a challenge with multiple sources of data. Now this is where data lakes come in more significantly. And again, I have no idea how to drop a link in, so I'm not going to share it. But we recently did a paper on data for artificial intelligence research with colleagues at university and Boeing as well. We basically, our argument was, what kind of a technology infrastructure do you need in order to be able to interact with meaningfully these kinds of multiple types of data? And so this is where the idea of data lakes, which are certainly growing in prominence, which is a place and a space where these data can exist and reside together, and you can start to do some of the staging or machine learning analysis and so on. By the same account, there's also complex data that's potentially deeply problematic. So, for example, you can look at psychophysiological data capture. You look at psychological data and building models and profiles of your students as well that are, that address some of those complex dynamics. So, that's another challenge around data and data integration. But there's two parts to the data question. One is the technical part. Technical parts are generally solvable. They just take time and they take the right amount of money in order to integrate and get your data sets together into an environment where the right stakeholders can have access to the right kinds of data, namely the institutional individuals that need to know completion rates, graduation rates, student performance, teachers, which students are succeeding, which ones need additional support and help, and so on. Researchers, what are the factors that influence and impact quality of learning, and so on. So that's the technical questions. How do you get that data done? That's a functional one, and it's an achievable and an answerable one. The much harder one are the privacy, ethics, and the questions around which populations are being impacted and are having a negative effect coming out of it. So we recently had a PhD approved, or request for a PhD that looks at AI automation and the impact of underrepresented populations, right? How is AI being experienced by individuals that are often ignored, because many AI models are backward looking, which means that historical data and historical biases are manifest in the present models that are being used in classrooms. And so we want to do a better job of understanding those experiences. Those are the complex problems. Those are the ones that take a long time to work through. And so the data question on the one hand is technically easy, culturally hard.
Sarah, did you want to pick up on that at all?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the culture, and I think this again comes back to the kind of core question of how do we understand what's actually happening, we understand the benefits of doing this kind of work or the risks of doing this kind of work. And there is, I've dealt with several different organizations that wanted to be able to understand some of the, say, for example, some of their students' uses better. So they, particular analysis I'm thinking about. But actually the work couldn't go forward simply because they just couldn't, they're like, we just can't resolve how to use this data to feel safe about it, right? To feel that they understand what's going to be happening, and no amount of explanation could actually, like for myself or for the data scientists that I worked with, helped that process. There are very significant concerns. And to be fair, there are a number of bad actors in the field. These concerns are not unreasonable, but how do we negotiate that to be able to gain the benefit of some of the work that we can do? And so again, I agree, this is cultural. The technology is there, the data is there. In terms of linking data sets and things like that, that's all solvable to a degree. But what the bigger problem is the cultural behaviors around that kind of work. And I think that's something that unfortunately, we've been stepped back a little bit after the pandemic, because there were, some with the Human Rights Watch report and some of the findings that came out of that in terms of what kind of data was just being captured without people knowing. So we have increased concerns around the idea of privacy and our rights and whose data and my data and who's capturing it and who isn't capturing it. And so it's a messy area still. And here, in Australia, we're struggling with it. Not struggling so much, but we're not quite there in terms of understanding how we can work with data, how people can share data. Like we're on a bit of a messy landscape. And we're working on it now, I guess, but it's definitely a limiting factor in the work.
And I guess this is part of the kind of AI literacy part of the puzzle too, isn't it? That how do we, if we go back to empowering learners, there's all this other work that needs to do to help the empowerment to come through.
Yeah, and it is, and I agree. And and really the way that it works when people feel at risk, they do one of two things. They retreat, they pull all the way back, or they lean in. There's like very little middle ground in there. And that's how we deal with that. And so with this, every grand event that we have that is putting data at risk, people withdraw further. I mean, look at the Optus debacle that we had just now. How do we handle data? What are the rules? Who's responsible? Someone must be responsible. Well, no. I mean, they are, but they aren't. We don't know. We simply don't know. So it just puts, and again, it's part of that level of literacy to make decisions about, well, how do I feel about this? What am I really at risk? To be able to understand what's really happening in this situation. So, and a lot of the structures around us, they're not really helping us. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in that space to catch up with what we can do technologically.
Thanks, Sarah. We've got a few more questions coming in. Oh, great. We've got one come up on the screen. particularly, I think it was what kind of research. I can't actually see all of the first question. Excuse me. I don't know if you can.
How to address some of the shortcomings we're talking about.
Yeah.
Postgraduate study or small grant. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, great. Can one of you answer to that or respond to that question?
George?
You need it.
Yeah, I'm looking. I've got a bunch of questions. Which one are you asking? I see about 6 on the screen here.
Okay, I'm looking at what kind of research and development do you think could be done at universities or EdTech startups that could help address some of the shortcomings that you're discussing today? People data, edu datification.
Okay, I think the datification one was a separate one. So I'm not sure. That one was dealing more with the social political bias of this. So whichever one you'd like me to answer, but I'm flexible.
Can we have the question on the screen again? That would make it helpful for us. Thank you.
I'll start, George, and you can follow.
Thanks,
some colleagues at University of Sydney, Claire Vogels and his research partner, doing some really interesting work, and have developed a small group of us that are looking at approaches inside and around the idea of technology democracy and data justice. And this is a kind of research initiative that looks at how we can bring more transparency and bring more awareness to what we're all doing with these tools and with this data. So the work in this space is looking, it sits kind of outside of the hard EdTech education space, and it sits more in a kind of policy kind of media space, which is quite interesting. There's a lot of critical work going on in that space around these technologies that sits next to the EdTech world, the proper EdTech world, but the world I generally exist in. So what it's about is looking at ways to, and there's lots of work that can be done in developing approaches from this, because it does a lot of good analysis of the technology, the implications for social implications, human-computer interactions, the implications for how we operate as individuals, how we operate at groups at a large level, how these technologies shape these practices, how they shape our behaviors, how they shape our thinking, and looking at how individuals are experiencing these technologies, get a better sense of and it's interesting because one of the questions earlier had said that we're talk too much about the tech and about the computation rather than the use, rather than looking at the user and looking at that experience on the individual and on the grand level. And there's a lot of work to understand what's happening in that space. And yeah, it wouldn't be expensive research at all. I mean, it would be your typical social science research of investigating how are you interacting with a particular platform, how are you interacting with a particular type of work, a particular practice related to this technology. And there's a lot to learn in that can feed back into design. And that's something that we really need to make that loop bigger. More need to be, particularly in the educational space. We do need more educators in the field, not just educators brought into EdTech companies. We are seeing more of that, which is great because previously that wasn't the case necessarily. But educators actually in the field, working, teaching, who are the users on the other end. So there's a lot of investigation to be done around that space. And I think that for me would be the most fruitful, but also the most, to get back to kind of our original remit, how to feed some of that back down to empowering students. How are they experiencing it really? And their experience is different than what my experience might be. But we don't understand what that is well. And we have bits and pieces and it's all over the place. But I think some really focused work with the idea of improving that transparency and improving that knowledge in that space with that particular objective would really, that's something we quite need in the field. I'd like to see more of that.
George, can you pick up on that? aspect as well?
Sure, I'll nail a couple quicker. So first of all, if I was an EdTech startup, I likely wouldn't work with universities. No, I mean that they don't work fast enough. They're clunky. Processes take an exuberantly long period of time within universities. So if I was creating a product in an EdTech space with an AI angle, I likely would do things, as much as possible. So I think within house, certainly be aware of the end use of the client, and namely, if I was serving a product or selling a product to the university sector, I would be targeted on addressing and meeting their needs or having faculty consult. But by and large, there's a reason innovation in AI and EdTech isn't happening in university, and that's primarily because we're our own worst enemy. We like to talk and we don't like to do. So I think that would be one of my primary starting points. But I think if you look at some of the shortcomings in general, I think it's really recognizing that these are multi-sector, multi-stakeholder problems that are being faced. There's no singular lens. There's primarily a contextual and a related dynamic that we need to pay attention to. And so when I would look at that end in particular, I think it's really about identifying and understanding what are discrete problems that exist within the university sector in particular that can be addressed by AI, because they're enormous. Like, think of everything we're doing right now in a university and assume everything will have an AI layer. So the question for me, if I was dealing with a startup and looking at research and research development, is how does AI enable new opportunities or generate new efficiencies or solve existing problems with any practice that occurs in the university, from advising through to teaching, through to assessment, through to learner record, through to the integration with industry or qualifications or transitions from regular primary, secondary education into university sector and so on. So my eyes would very much be focused on what are the things that we're doing now that AI will make obsolete in the university sector, and I'd focus on solving those problems. Right now, to create an AI-centric company is actually very affordable from the EdTech side because of platforms like Azure, because of Google's infrastructure, because of Amazon's infrastructure. Even from the last 5 years ago, short word is anyone with a vision, maybe access to a few technical skills, can create an AI EdTech company. And that's something that wasn't possible even a few years ago. But the costs have come down, the computation has increased. Quite often the missing element is the data, though.
It's interesting, like you said, use the word vision, which is something I'd like to pick up on as well. This idea that, like, having the imagination, I'm feeling like one of our roles in the university sector potentially to help support students, our learners, to have those visions, like to be able to go forward with that vision, like developing that creative aspect to their thinking so that they can apply it to these problems that we're talking about.
Perhaps I think, literacies is one aspect, literacy and implications is another, right? So while we might not be great at building EdTech or AI initiatives, I think we do have a responsibility socially to meet the needs of society, to evaluate and understand the impact of things, to contribute to our awareness of the inequality and the systemic inefficiencies and the lack of fairness or the bias that exists in those systems. Morally, what kind of a society do we want to be a part of? Which parts of the education process do we want to hand off to an AI system, and what are the implications on that for humanity? So I think those kinds of things very much we need to be centrally attending to as a university enterprise. And I think particularly listening to the voice of the learners. I think that's often the voice that gets lost in AI. We've built a university system that serves the needs of administrators, faculty, and society, and an AI system that addresses those of the student would be an entirely novel output.
I know we're getting towards the end of our session, so I'd like to open it up to both of you to, I'd like to say take-home message, but I don't know, that sounds a bit drab. An inspirational moment for us to all take away so that we go away feeling empowered. Can I open that up? Can you give us your best pitch on your thoughts?
What are my thoughts?
No pressure. No pressure.
I was in a class observation once. The teacher said that to the student. He says, "But sir, I have no thoughts." Sir, I have no thoughts. I also don't have a pencil. I think for myself, when I think about, and it's interesting. My focus is always much more on the schools level. That's where my research sits and where I look. And I think it's really interesting in that space. I think my take home is the idea of I would like to see schools, teachers, and students be able to benefit from the advantages of using, we'll say, AI, of the advantages of personalization, of improving feedback, being able to lighten teachers' workloads. I think there's lots of incredible advantages. I think that there are, but as I said before, I think one of the things that would be really critical in that space, particularly schools, is to have a closer look at the stakeholders that are involved in the design of these tools, so that they're really looking at. And I think if you want to start an EdTech startup, this would be the one to look at. My own bias coming through on this would be to look at one that really addresses specific needs, and they're close. They're often close to it, but they're in some, again, like I said, they have educators in there, but go to the ground. Like there is a disconnect in that space, and quite likely because when the level of AI literacy, the capacity to say what we want to understand, isn't strong, and so there's some building up to do on that other side, and kind of that reveals the complexity of it in terms of how we're actually going to get there. But that's, again, I think there's a lot of potential that is sitting at the door, that with some, for me, more education is always the answer. It's not always the case, but that's kind of how I see it, by improving our understanding of it. And I think really in that we need to bring these tools in for students to be better prepared, for them to better understand, for them to be able to go to university, and then being able to engage in the ways of working that they will learn there. I'm very idealistic in this, but I think this is something that we can work towards, and I think we're not far away from it. I think, like I said before, we have a lot of cultural work to do. Some of it is getting there, but I think there's a lot more to be done. And so I think to do that, we need I won't say we need more research necessarily, because research isn't always the answer for it. And as George says, universities, we are quite slow, and we don't always get there. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in the departments and at the school level, of working with the vision of the technologies that you want to use to be able to address what you want to do with your school, and in higher ed, what do we want our learners to be able to do? There's more work to be done around that, and I'm hoping we catch up on it. I'm hoping that we, now that we're all back together and we can spend time in the same room together, that we can do a little bit more of this work. But again, to be idealistic, I'd like to see that cultural work happen. I think it can, and I think we can open up a lot more opportunity once we start chipping away at that.
Thanks, Sarah. That it feels optimistic, so that feels good to me. George, what would you like to finish on for us?
Well, I think for me, AI is not a thing to think about as a maybe we should prepare for it. I think AI is a given. The way that we've structured society, we have largely and technology advancements and the economic system that we're part of, the space of information abundance. I think on a positive note, AI is going to solve many substantial problems related to health, related to questions of longevity, and the list goes on. So I think AI similarly is going to provide ways of more efficient, more dynamic, more adaptive, more flexible education. There's going to be a stormy process of negotiating the power structure, the ethical implications, the role of the university in this kind of a society. But I think one of the biggest things we need to start to recognize as universities related to AI and other things is that we're no longer the only show. We're no longer the central node. We're increasingly a node as part of a broader learning and knowledge network, and external providers, other platforms. The job skills work that's happening in Australia right now clearly signals that while universities, TAFE, and other sectors are still there, there's a growing range of providers, and that's 100% mirrored in the US as well. So I think the reality for us is there's fantastic opportunities for efficiency gains and higher quality outcomes through the use of AI. By the same account, we should expect a stormy period, because there are people that will lose power and people that will gain power. And that very rarely is a smooth process when you have that kind of an exchange.
Great. That was real. Thank you very much. I appreciated your both of your thoughts, particularly in the last part. And Luke has joined us. I think we've come to the end of our conversation time.
That's correct. I'm sure we could keep talking about this for days and days and days. But we do need to wrap up. So thank you so much to Sarah, George, and Lisa for lending your time and fantastic insights on how AI is enabling active learning. And I appreciate you sending us all home on a positive outlook. It's always good to wrap up something with a positive outlook. So thank you very much. Brilliant. I would now like to welcome Laura Menesesco, the Director of Business Development at Maths Pathway, to the stage. Laura, apologies if I got your surname completely incorrect. Laura's been working with schools for more than 15 years, helping educators discover and implement meaningful technology, content, and PD to deliver better teaching and learning. As the Head of Public Engagement at Maths Pathway, Laura leads the teams responsible for understanding the unique nature of each school and customizing the best approach to Maths Pathway in their school. Laura, I'd like to welcome you to the stage and hand over.
Thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here. It's so exciting to talk about the importance of AI and big data in terms of what we can do for teaching and learning. Maths Pathway, you might have heard about it. Hopefully you have, and we're doing a really good job of getting the word out there. We are a complete teaching and learning model that focuses on creating a really personalized learning experience for students. So unfortunately, for most of us, when we're in school or when we teach at school, the reality is that it's not enough to try to individualize learning to where we think students are at. And with mathematics, the moment that you miss a particular concept, it's really hard to build it from there, right? So if you fall off the wagon, unfortunately, getting on the train again can be super hard. And we really aim to solve that issue, to be able to create a differentiated model that teachers can very easily implement to address students and meet students at the learning at the point of learning. It's a very comprehensive model where we not only diagnose where students are at and do that, I guess, that ongoing assessment to make sure that the data is relevant on a real-time basis, but also create a course that it's individual to each student in the classroom. It's really about putting at the center of the equation both the teacher and the students, empowering them to make the most out of the learning experience. But someone that can tell you a lot better what it feels like to teach this way and to implement the model, it's Batsheva. She is an amazing educator that joined Coburg High School in 2018, and she taught maths from year 7 to year 12, and entered the school with no idea probably of what Maths Pathway was all about, and got introduced to the model, and she can tell you what it feels like to really teach in this way.
Thank you, Laura. So my name is Batsheva, and I'll be talking to you today about what it's been like to teach using Maths Pathway. I remember joining the school in 2018, and I sat down for my orientation thinking this was going to be a simple, here are your classes, this is what you're teaching, goodbye. But I sat down with the head of maths at the time, and he explained to me how teaching maths can often feel like quite an impossible task. It can feel like you're standing up, giving a TED talk for 10 minutes, and then scrambling to actually teach students based on where they're at. There's so much administration work involved, having to sit down before each class and plan, okay, I know these students are going to need these extra worksheets, let me quickly put those together. I know these students are very far advanced, so let me try find some more resources that can cater towards them so they're not getting bored. And it can feel like a real struggle. And he turned to me and said, well, we do things here differently. We don't have a textbook. You're not going to be standing up at the start of each class and just talking to students for 10 minutes. We use this program called Maths Pathway. And how I was introduced to it working is that at the beginning of the year, the students are diagnosed, as Laura was saying. They get this test of questions. That's an adaptive test. And the test really gets a good understanding of what students understand different concepts at different levels in the curriculum. And the test is adaptive, so that if a student is able to show throughout this test that they actually don't know anything about fractions, they're given a few fraction questions in different areas and they can't show knowledge of that at all, the test isn't going to be putting forth to them questions on algebraic fractions. So they start off with that testing. Once that's completed, students and us teachers and the parents as well get this comprehensive learning map. So we're able to see on a really detailed level what every student knows at each level. Where are their gaps in their learning? They've come to the school at year 7. What do they not know from year 4? And where exactly are they? In addition to the benefits, and I'll explain what this learning map actually does in terms of their future learning, I found it really helpful that students are able to have some direction and autonomy on their learning. They're able to see this map and say, oh, okay, here are my gaps. This is what I'd like to fill. These are my priorities. These are my goals with maths in the future. This is what I'd like to study in the future. And this is what I know I need to have. And it's also great to have that clarity with parents as well. So students have completed this testing. They've got this learning map. Everybody's on the same page, knowing where each student is at. And they now have access to different learning resources using the program. So the first thing that we spend a lot of time doing with the students is modules. Now, modules is a word for, I guess, somewhere between like a worksheet and an activity where a student works on their own, at their own pace, on a certain content area that's linked to the curriculum. So say they may be learning how to add fractions. It's got really deep scaffolding in each module. It's specifically targeted to a certain level in the curriculum. And they're working through those. The teacher at the same time also has access to what we call a mini lesson planner. So as a teacher, I'm able to see which students are working on which modules at the same time. And the program automatically groups those students for me. I mean, it is able to say, well, these 4 students are actually all working on this same area together. Here's an activity that you can do with all of them. And it's great. It takes away any of me having to actually try work that out on my own. In addition to all the other teaching responsibilities I have, I'm able to see at a glance what students actually need. We've also got access to this feature called targeted intervention. So if a student worked on a module, let's say they were an advanced student in this area, they've been working on quadratics, and they've done some modules on it, and they've had an assessment on it. I'll get to the assessment aspect in a minute. And they're still struggling with it. I get this notification. This student is actually really struggling with this concept. And yes, they've got these scaffolded modules they can work with, but I'm going to need to intervene and do something extra. So that's also a really great notification for me to get as a teacher. I'm not having to walk around the classroom and try to figure out which student is working on what and where might they be stuck. Trying to get information out of teenagers can be interesting. So this is great for that. And I also, as a teacher, have access to what we call these rich learning tasks. So we can do whole class activities. The program provides some activities where I can do it as a big group, and the activity has multiple entry points. So no student, regardless of their level or where they're at or what they're learning, will struggle to engage with this activity somehow. So there's a lot going on in the learning. We've got like all these aspects and features to do throughout, and we schedule it in fortnights. Now, at the end of every fortnight, each student gets an individualized assessment. And this assessment is created by the program. I have nothing to do with it. And it creates based on what the student's been learning. So in the past fortnight, if the student has chosen to learn about adding fractions, subtracting fractions, let's say multiplying and dividing fractions, and that's all they've really been working on in that fortnight, their test is going to be specifically targeted to that learning. And they're going to be receiving questions based on work that they've done. Through the assessment, the program then decides, well, does the student actually have satisfactory knowledge of what they've learned? Is it something that we're not happy to say they've mastered? Do they need to keep working on it? The student gets that feedback. So yes, you have shown mastery. No, you're still struggling. I'm able to get that feedback. And it's been great as a teacher to see the progress that Maths Pathway has actually done throughout my time since 2018. The modules, the activities, and all these features that we've been working on in groups is constantly changing, constantly improving, constantly becoming more accurate. In our school, we've got about 800 students using Maths Pathway and about 20 staff as well. So with that group of staff, we're able to collaborate a lot. Our faculty meetings every 2 weeks. We're able to engage with PD related to the use of Maths Pathway in our classroom. We have that collaboration with the school consultant as well to address any struggles we may be having or any ideas on how to implement any of the new updates. I guess the outcome for me using this program in the classroom has been that I feel like I'm developing really meaningful and deep relationships with my students. I'm able to help them exactly where they're at. They're able to progress at a rate that is relevant to them. And it feels like I'm making a bigger difference using this program as a tool.
Thank you so much. I've got questions. There's also questions coming in the chat. So I'm going to just kick off straight away. Laura, how important is AI into what Maths Pathways offers?
So it's pretty fundamental to what we do. The use of big data and the right type of AI behind the scenes alongside the expertise of our learning team means that we can look at how the content is refined over time on one side. So one of the really exciting things is that both in terms of the questions or the assessment items, we can look at the pass rate and how concepts are being assessed in a way that actually hits the mark. And we are not testing that with just a sample of 13 students, right? It's not just a class or just a cohort. We can test these things with 80,000 students. So we can really refine how to do this in a meaningful way. And of course, then the fact that we have these pathways that the system can recommend on a student based on prior learning and mastery wouldn't be possible without the right technology. One of the other areas that has been fascinating to work with in terms of AI has been how we develop better, not just better diagnostic assessment or formative assessment, but also non-routine questions and things that can be used for refreshing the memory on particular concepts in maths.
Right. So something you mentioned then kind of triggered something for me. So the recognition of prior learning, so recognizing what you've studied and what you're doing. And Batsheva, that goes back to something that you were talking about, and that's that individual basis. So as an educator, how does Maths Pathways help students on an individual basis? Do you have like a case study or a usage or an example that you can give us where you've seen it help that individual person?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. One story comes to mind. I think it's probably one of my most extreme cases where last year I had a student in Year 9 who was tested at the start of the year and indicated that she was more or less at a level 4 in the curriculum at Year 9. And I know that if that student had been in a standard Year 9 classroom where I was having to teach with the textbook, I don't think there would have been any progress made. She would have felt isolated. She wouldn't have been able to access that knowledge. She wouldn't have understood most of what was going on. I would have had to be trying to sort of make shift with worksheets that were kind of at her level as one of my many tasks to do. But what we were able to achieve throughout that year was her being really engaged with work that was at her level, that she could connect with. I was able to find areas that she was struggling with based on this program. And by the end of the year, she was testing indicating a level 7. So she had made almost 3 years growth in that 1 year, where I'm so certain that in a standard classroom, she would have made very little growth. So I think for me, that story showed just how much this program is able to help students actually learn, not feel isolated. And I've felt very much like I'm not sure I could ever return to teaching with a textbook. I don't know if there's any other way.
That's fantastic. Look, we've ran out of time, but I wanted to thank you both, Laura and Batsheva. That's just a great case study, and the exploration into what Maths Pathways is doing and scaffolding for individual students and the use of AI in that is, it just seems like there's going to be some fantastic positive outcomes to the students. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Luke. Great to be part of it.
Thank you.
So that wraps up today's session. I would like to thank you all, thank all today's presenters and guest speakers for lending their time and insights. A big thank you again to ASCILITE for their partnership in this program. If you are an EdTech entrepreneur with a great case study to share, please submit it via the expression of interest. The link should be coming up on the chat. Thanks again, everyone who tuned in today. Have an incredible evening, and we will see you shortly. Thanks.